right? Or more specifically, the snake in the tunnel. Now, this is going to be a linkage, a tight linkage of European currencies moving within a band of global currency fluctuations, i.e., that's the snake and the tunnel. That the European currencies are going to be moving together within the wider band of currency fluctuations of the entire global system. Okay, so the snake in the tunnel is a local replacement for the Bretton Woods system that the Europeans are going to try to do, going it on their own, because America won't do it anymore, right? The US dollar isn't going to be the reserve currency of the entire planet's trading system anymore, because the US currency, the US dollar, is no longer backed with gold. Nixon has taken the dollar off the gold standard. Now, that said, the European approach at first wasn't very successful. You have, in short order, the 1973 oil crisis, and what this did was it revealed a kind of a cultural clash among the European players. And I need to explain this to you, right? So in Europe, you have some countries that, like France, who believe that government can play a strong role, and this is a Keynesian idea, right? We talked about Keynes a moment ago, John Maynard Keynes being one of the key economists of the original Bretton Woods negotiations. Now, his ideas are still very much alive in the 1970s, and some countries in Europe are advocates for his ideas and believe that government can play a role in fighting against unemployment. And if you know anything about economics and Keynesianism, and this is of course how America got out of the Great Depression in the 1930s and 40s, but it means government can basically step in and hire people, right? If you're in a depression, one way to get out of it is for government to step into the market and hire people, give them jobs, put them to work, and eventually, of course, through their consumption, you send signals to the marketplace that consumption is possible, manufacturing gets going again, and employment picks up in order to manufacture the uptick demand, to manufacture for the uptick in demand in the marketplace. Okay, that's basic Keynesianism. Now, other countries, like Germany, have an inbuilt suspicion that that idea is kind of bogus. Now, it's not, first of all, it's not a bogus idea. It's actually, Keynesianism has worked many, many times in history. The US economy recovered from the Great Depression precisely because of it. So, but the Germans had had a bad experience with inflation in World War II, and they believed that inflation was politically very risky, right? Because of course, between World War I and World War II, when they had that inflation, it hurt the German economy so bad that it created a very bad emotional kind of resonance, and led to politics of hatred, the rise of fascism, and the rise of Hitler. So German memory, within living memory, has this sort of paranoia about inflation ever coming again. And so the Germans don't want to engage in government spending because it would encourage inflation. So the German central bank, known as the Bundesbank, was actually constitutionally mandated not to allow inflation to take place. Now, Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. The German central bank is therefore the most strong central bank in the European economy. So regardless of what France and others want to do in terms of fighting unemployment, the German central bank, the Bundesbank, is going to have a very strong ideological influence on government spending. It's going to have a very strong ideological influence on what this mechanism, the snake in the tunnel, can be allowed to do, and it's going to influence the debates in and around that time about how this system is going to evolve, right? So do I have you this far? I hope so. So point being then, by the time we get into the 1970s, when there is this recognition that on the one hand, Swedish and German and British manufacturers are probably going to prefer to be able to locate their manufacturing where labor is cheap, and having a single currency would be a really neat way to offset the cost of the fluctuations in currency and the unpredictability of currency fluctuations, and it would allow European manufacturers to do what American manufacturers do, which is, if a guy in New York wants to build a car, he doesn't locate it in New York City where labor is expensive. He's going to go to the Midwest where labor is abundant and cheap, and he's going to build his factory out there. And that's how the American economy works. I mean, that's kind of how you want it to work, right? Profits get made on the coasts, cycle back in investment terms into the Midlands, and that way there's a distribution of wealth, and everyone sort of wins. But America has one currency, and that's what makes that possible. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, but so the point being, anyway, that this debate is really starting to take place now. This debate really begins to shape the fate of what is going to become the euro. So you have people who sort of want to build something like a European version of what the Americans have, right? And those people are the people who first articulate a vision of the euro as early as 1969, and then into 1970. You have the publication of reports by people like Pierre Werner, who was Luxembourg's prime minister, and this is called the Werner Plan. And what I have to emphasize here is that this Werner Plan, he was quite serious about trying to emulate the American system, and part of what he was going to suggest would be part of the European economy would be this thing called a transfer payments system based on the United States tax and transfer mechanism. Now, the key issue, right, whether you're going to have that, the USA has it, and you're going to see people like Yanis Varoufakis talking about this a lot. But the US has one, this tax and transfer system. And what it does is this, right? Think about it, right? There are, as we were saying a moment ago, tons of rich people living on the coasts in the United States who have wealth, right? That's where they all live, right? New York and LA, lots of rich people live there, right? But the federal taxes they pay, everyone in the United States pays federal taxes. The federal taxes they pay, and if you're the wealthier you are, the more tax you pay, of course. So the tax take, because more rich people live on the coasts, East Coast and West Coast, than in the Midlands, the tax take on the coast is much bigger than it is from the Midwest, for example, from Ohio. So that means that federal taxes taken from all over the country at different proportions, depending on whether you're rich or poor, get pooled together in Washington, D.C. in the Treasury, and then go back out to where people are poorest through vehicles like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, earned income tax credit, those sorts of things. Other government programs, all designed basically to improve people's standards of living and help the poor. And what do people do with this transferred money, with the assistance they get through these programs? Well, they spend it on goods and services, which generates employment and cycles back into the economy again. Now, some Americans think that, of course, that the government taxes too much, but it is important to remember, always remember this, that if that mechanism didn't exist, the US economy would become impossibly lopsided. So the wealth would just sort of stay on the coasts and it would only ever come back to us in the form of loans. And actually, indeed, that's, some people would say that it's a weakening of the US tax and transfer system in the first place. That was a primary culprit for what happened in 2008 in the financial crisis, and why there was a financial crisis in 2008 at all. But that's another story, right? But the point being that the surplus profits on the coasts, we need to get them cycled, and the tax and transfer system does that in America. Now, the point is that the European plan under the Werner Plan was going to have something like this, but as it developed, the plan for the euro, they decided to drop it. Okay, and there is no tax and transfer system in a full sense in the European Union today. There are some things like structural development funds. There's the common agricultural policy and the like, but that's it. And we will be talking about the common agricultural policy and things like that in future weeks. But there's no systematic tax and transfer system. So on this slide, we move the story a little bit further along. We're starting in 1979, which was kind of like the Redux effort. I think the European Union policymakers and planners at the time had a sense that the snake system wasn't really going to cut it. In fact, the snake had kind of come to an unceremonial end. Because, again, the oil crisis sort of just shook things up too much. And you had this divergence, as I was saying, the culture of the various countries involved. The French culture being sort of focused on fighting unemployment and taking this view that government could be Keynesian. And the Germans, for their part, taking this view that inflation had to be addressed at all costs. And those two theories run against each other. They're not compatible for the simple reason that if government is spending money on generating employment, that is stimulus, right? You remember after 2008, this was the big question about passing a stimulus. Obama's stimulus plan was seen as a very important thing for the United States government to develop. Well, reason being that stimulus is, comes from government spending. It's inflationary, right? It puts people to work. Those people are spending at the shops and at the stores, buying goods and services, and consequently, the demand for goods and services is going up, and that's reflected in an increase in price, which is to say, it's sort of basic economics. It's how supply and demand balance each other out in the long run. So we have this sort of fear of inflation of the Germans and this desire to deal with unemployment on the French. And of course, the 1970s is a difficult economic time. The stagflation in the US, which is a whole other story. We're not going to get into that right now. But just to say that the global economy wasn't doing particularly well. So, but that's not to say that the issues that the manufacturers in Europe were facing went away. There was still a desire to lock in a mechanism to deal with currency fluctuations and make that possible, make it possible for European manufacturers in the wealthy countries to locate their manufacturing in the poorer countries where where labor is cheaper. This is exactly what is happening in America. This is exactly what the Europeans want to be able to do in Europe. And this is, of course, explained very well by Yanis Varoufakis in his book, which you guys are reading. So, the 1979 attempt to reconcile this issue is something much more like a serious effort to deal with or replicate the Bretton Woods system. Now, like the Bretton Woods system, what it's going to do is it's going to fix the exchange rates. We call this the ERM. You're going to hear a lot about the ERM from me in this slide. And within this system, the Deutschmark, the German currency, is going to play the role of the dollar. But it's not a great comparison with to say that it was like a mini or European Bretton Woods system. Obviously, we had the snake in the tunnel, but that fell apart with the oil crisis, and that was completely voluntary. This is going to be a little bit more locked in. It's going to be a fixed exchange rate system, but there's going to be significant differences in some ways between this system and the system that which is going to replace the snake in the tunnel, but at the same time isn't going to quite live up to the bar that had been set by Bretton Woods. So why is that? Well, on the one hand, the European Monetary Union, the EMU, is going to have this thing called EMCF, European Monetary Cooperation Fund. Now that's a mouthful. Maybe you guys don't necessarily need to know the technical details of this, but the point is that it was backed by the central banks of the member states, and it's going to serve in a way that kind of allows countries to access special funds in case their currencies get attacked by speculators. This would be very, very similar to what the IMF did within the Bretton Woods system. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, is going to be a lender of last resort to countries that need intervention in their currencies, sometimes to bring those currencies back up if speculators are selling them short. And that happens sometimes, right? If speculators see a country that they believe the currency is overvalued, they'll play the difference between long-term and short-term markets to try to take advantage of arbitrage, if you know the economic principles involved. Anyway, now the German Bundesbank is not entirely keen on having the function of the IMF ascribed to it within the European system. Okay, it doesn't want to see situations developing where it is going to have to add money to the money supply within Europe. Again, why? Because it always comes back to this with the Bundesbank. They don't want to stimulate inflation. If the German Bundesbank is plowing money into peripheral European economies because they're under pressure from speculators, that's going to be stimulatory, and that's not what the Bundesbank sees as its role. In fact, it's the opposite of what the Bundesbank is constitutionally obliged, remember, to do. So that's one major difference between the Bretton Woods system and the EMU, or the EMS, whichever you prefer to call it. Now, a second difference that we need to know about here is that the stability of the Bretton Woods mechanism was based on the strength of the US dollar as the numeraire, or global reserve currency, right? What do we mean by that? That sounds technical. It's not really. It just means that central banks all over the world were holding on to the US dollar as a secure currency because it maintained its value. It was backed by gold during the time of the Bretton Woods Standard, and it was just as easy to carry the US dollar rather, as it was to carry gold. So there were reasons for this, and it made sense. But the reliability of the ERM is not going to be anything to do with the standardization of the Deutschmark as a global currency. Instead, it's going to be to do with the culture of the Bundesbank, the credibility of the Bundesbank moving forward into the future as a bank that works to ensure stability of prices within the European marketplace. So this is in a sense saying, Bundesbank, we know you're constitutionally obliged to stop inflation from taking place. We're going to factor that into our assumptions about how the European economy is going to work as we make our investment decisions. And in that sense, then, it's a cultural commitment on the part of the sort of Bundesbank culture. It's a cultural commitment that impresses investors about the ERM. And so the picture that's coming through here then is not a picture that looks like the Bretton Woods system, wherein, remember, as I was saying, different countries had flexibility to fight unemployment if they wanted to. Instead, under this mechanism, we have, at the very birth of the euro, at the very first sign of the euro's inception, not a tax and transfer system, not a mechanism that can fight unemployment, but in fact, the Bundesbank model, which is about fighting inflation, about fighting the possibility of prices rising, by maintaining price stability. So it was already, in this sense, austerity in a manner of speaking, right? The conditions were already primed at the birth of the euro that the euro would be following this Bundesbank model, and austerity would be in the culture, so to speak, of the euro right from the outset. So this is a good conclusion for us to understand, right? Because it sets us up for an understanding of what's going to happen when the euro comes into existence in the 90s, and what's going to happen when the euro runs into a crisis in 2008. So again, though, this is a cultural variable that's coming out of it's a cultural variable that's spreading, that's going to be applied to all of Europe, because there is this contradiction that is inherent in the European economy in a post-Bretton Woods world. They have to do something. There has to be some kind of voluntary coordination in order to maintain the integrity of Europe's internationalized or transnationalized manufacturing base. This is the vision. They want to integrate the European economy. They want to have production located where labor is cheap. So on the one hand, definitely there is this need for coordination. And in a post-Bretton Woods world, the dollar is a very turbulent currency. So the German manufacturers want out. They understandably want coordination. They want some kind of way to link into cheap labor in other parts of Europe. On the other hand, though, without some kind of concrete monetary union, there is going to be a risk of speculation. And what this means is that simply coordinating the currencies, it can work well. And in fact, the ERM did work quite well for 10 years. But there's going to be unpredictable variables along the way, right? So one of them, for example, is the one that, you probably can guess where I'm going with this. It's the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, this is, it's impossible to understate the significance of this moment for the monetary history of Europe, because it had to be paid for, right? The Germans decided to make every Eastern European Deutschmark convertible to a Western European, a Western German Deutschmark. And they did this because once the wall collapsed, they believed in national reunification, not slowly, but right away. The people wanted it. It was the democratic wishes of hundreds of thousands of people who are protesting on the streets. It had to happen. There was no real choice in the matter. So East German unification with Germany could not happen slowly. It had to happen right away. And to pay for it, because the two economies were radically different. The East German economy had been under communism for decades. It was quite backwards. The industrial plant was in poor repair. A lot needed to happen to bring standards of living and standards of economic production up to par with what had been going on in West Germany, which was a powerhouse and one of the leading economies in the world. So to do this, the Germans had to issue bonds and raise interest rates, which had the effect, of course, of driving up the price of the Deutschmark and making it harder for countries in non-economically aligned cycles, that is to say, poorer countries like Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, they just weren't in the same economic condition as Germany was, yet they were being asked to ride out this storm as German interest rates were going up and the price of the Deutschmark was going up. The exchange rate mechanism, the band of the currencies that all the currencies had to move in to stay linked to each other, was moving upwards. Because the Deutschmark is such a big currency, it's distorting the value of the band, right? It's pulling the band upwards, which means the Irish pound, the Spanish lira, Spanish peseta, Portuguese escudo, all have to move with it, right? So what's going to happen here is that speculators are going to see a problem here. There's no more capital controls in Europe. We're moving into a phase now, the late 1980s into the 1990s. We have the Delors report, which contained the blueprint for what would be known as the Maastricht Treaty. And what that had proposed was a deregulation of capital controls, which means that all the countries of Europe are going to have free movement of capital and not just goods and services. Now, that's part of the plan. That's what people wanted. They wanted to have capital market liberalization in order to complete the single market. That's what you have in America, after all, right? But what it meant was, and remember, we've just had German reunification. We have upwards pressure on the Deutschmark, pulling the band within which all the currencies have to move upwards with it. But we've just introduced capital market liberalization under Delors' plan, beginning in 1990 with the Maastricht Treaty. What this means is that investors in Europe and elsewhere can buy and sell each other's currencies with very little by the way of a transaction tax. And that free movement of capital among the member states in the process of trying to align their economies with a much more advanced economy like Germany's meant that speculators would spot overvaluation, right? The Irish currency, the British currency could be overvalued relative to what they should be, what they can really take in the global marketplace. And this is, of course, the dirty secret, that the ERM was underway. It had been functioning well for 10 years, but the economies themselves weren't really that aligned. I mean, Greece, Ireland, borderline second world countries, Germany, sort of really advanced first world country. How are these economies going to be integrated? We don't have a tax and transfer system. So the wealth from the core is not recycling to the periphery, and the West German Deutschmark being the main anchor currency of the alignment is going to be very hard for these countries to keep up with. And people like George Soros, famous guy, a lot of people talk about him these days as being some kind of arch conspiracy nemesis dude that was backing Hillary Clinton or something, and is behind the Black Lives Matter movement. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that today, but back then he was simply just known as a currency speculator. And he bet on the UK. He shorted the UK, as it's known in the vernacular of global trading markets. And he bet that the UK would not be able to remain fully committed to the ERM, that the UK currency, the British pound, could not stay valuable as it was currently valued, could not stay as highly valued as it was currently valued. So he decided to sell it short. And that meant the other currencies had to step in to try to artificially prop up the UK pound. They failed, and so the British pound left the ERM. And this is a very controversial moment in the history of the development of the euro. It's known as Black Wednesday, when the project of the euro basically almost fell apart. So to wrap up here then, we have this desire for the euro in order to stop speculation. We have this desire mentioned when I was talking on the previous slide for manufacturers to have this predictability in currency movements so they can transnationalize production. And then we have this third factor, German reunification. And we even now have a fourth factor, which is full capital market liberalization under stage 1 of the Maastricht Treaty or the Treaty of the European Union. And these four factors together that I've just talked about in the last two slides contrive together, boom, Britain is going to be out of the euro. Actually, Italy was out too, but Italy comes back in again later once the euro is underway. So the point is, this is a major challenge for the European exchange rate mechanism, and it's a major setback for the euro project. But the project survived, and I think here's what we need to know moving forward, because we're just about to start talking about the build up to 2008 and the financial crisis. Just three things we kind of need to know moving forward. I have to emphasize these. The European Central Bank was completely based on the German Bundesbank model. It was hardwired to resist and fight against inflation, and that meant that the European Central Bank was going to run on a tight interest rate policy, whereas in the 50s and 60s, the states under the Bretton Woods system would have had a lot of autonomy if they preferred to fight unemployment instead of inflation under the European Central Bank's control, which is an extension of the Bundesbank, moving into the Maastricht era. we're going to have basically very tight interest rates, and the monetary policy option is no longer going to be available for member states, right? Now, that's number one. Number two, unlike in the United States of America, where the federal government can borrow and engage in fiscal expenditure as it wishes because it taxes and transfers, the European Union is not doing that. It's not a federal borrower and it's not a federal taxer. So under Article 104 of the Treaty of the European Union, it's made very, very clear it's going to be left to the national central banks to issue bonds if they want to borrow. Now, this is key. What it means is, and I'm going to quote a textbook here that's not a textbook that you guys are reading for me this week, but it's this idea that there's going to be no risk pooling of national public debts. In other words, each member state is going to be responsible for its own credibility in the face of the need to borrow overseas, if it needs to borrow, in a very speculative era, right? So that's going to be something to watch out for. It's going to come back into play. Article 104 is going to come back into play when we hit the crisis, because it means the states are going to be on their own if they need to borrow money to make ends meet, right? So now, thirdly, that was second. Thirdly, under Maastricht's Treaties Convergence criteria, which are the criteria through which the states are going to be integrating in order and aligning with each other in terms of their economies to set up the euro, the states were not going to be allowed to have borrowings of over 60% of GDP. That means that they're going to be limited again in what they can do to offset unemployment if there's a problem. So you can see, really, they're in this kind of like Bundesbank straitjacket. Okay, the entire model to set up the euro is going to be highly influenced, highly conditioned by this culture of the old German Bundesbank model. And even as we're moving into a new era, the era of the euro, it's still going to be this very German culture that characterizes what the European Union is able to do with the maintenance and management of the common currency. Now, the European Union's common currency worked fine, it seems, for the first 10 years. The European Union was able to proceed with a number of objectives that it wanted to have, including the liberalization of financial services, which allowed German banks to do business in Ireland, Dutch banks to do business in Ireland, Irish banks to do business in France, etc., etc. And all of these things seemed like very, very good ideas. And for a while, things looked good, right? Compared to the EMS, the ERM, the euro seemed to do a really good job at stabilizing prices. But Europe had an unemployment problem, which was lingering since at least the recession of the 1980s, and growth wasn't exactly strong. Things were fine, though. But under the surface, there was a slowly building ticking time bomb, because the whole time, and now especially German banks can do business in Ireland, the whole time capital flows are starting to move. Why? I think Varoufakis does a good job of explaining this, actually. Germans are savers, right? And they have an aging population, meaning that the pension funds in Germany need to invest where returns are going to be strong. Now, Ireland has and the other peripheral European countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal have younger populations. Those populations want to move into the world and have access to credit so that they can get a mortgage for a house, for example. So the German pension funds are all too happy to lend to Ireland, for example, and Ireland and other peripheral European countries through the late 90s and into the early 2000s, experienced massive property booms. And the money was coming from basically German pension funds. Now, the investors, the pension funds, assumed that we're making an assumption here, right? Now we've just said on the previous page that Article 104 of the TEU banned bailouts. Bailouts were forbidden. That meant that the European institutions would not be allowed to deal with banks should they make mistakes and end up in trouble, right? Make bad bets, in other words. And what that means is that nominally the responsibility, should one of those banks hit the wall, is going to lie with the member state of origin. So Ireland, for example, would have had 3 or 4 major banks involved in the property markets at the time, flush with cash from German pension funds, lending that money out to Irish citizens, kind of like what happened here in America. There was a massive expansion in the mortgage market here as well in the same time frame. But so in a sense, what we have to understand is that the investors were, functionally speaking, making a bet. They were making a bet that despite the illegality of bailouts, that they could go ahead and take moves that were so incredibly risky that they would actually compromise the economies that they were part of, the very national economies that they were part of. In other words, if they lost the bet, not only would their bank go out of business, but possibly the whole economy would collapse. These banks are very, very large relative to the size of the economy, right? Especially in a small country like Ireland. Or even think a more amazing example was Iceland, where the banks were really huge compared to the size of the national economy. So the banks are betting, and in a sense the German pension funds are betting as well, that even though Article 104 exists and bailouts are forbidden, they're betting that ultimately these small economies, because they are too small to handle a banking crisis on their own, of this nature, of the nature that was coming, that ultimately the European Union's institutions would have to be called in order to bail out these flawed banks, right? So this is a classic game of chicken. Article 104 was the law, but the game of chicken was basically saying that we know that your law is only going to last 5 seconds in this reality. There's a structural reality here that your law doesn't take account of, and we're going to call your bluff. We're going to play a game of chicken with you, and we're generating a system here that is too big to fail, right? It's too big for the European Union to let go and let slide. You can, in the United States, as what happened in 2008, you can let Lehman Brothers collapse, go out of business. That's fine. But you can't let Portugal go out of business. You can't let Ireland go out of business. These are countries with voters. They're member states of the European Union. The European Union's entire credibility depends on it being able to stand up as an integrated economy that takes care of everyone and that works for everyone. So this is going to be terrible public relations, and so the European Union is going to have to do something. Now, when the crisis hits, 2008, this potential for hypocrisy, in other words, the result of the game of chicken, whoever's going to blink first is going to get revealed. And of course, who blinks first? It has to be the European Union, okay? Because, well, if they had let these banks go to the wall, the feedback would have hit those German pension funds that were supplying the money in the hope of getting a return pretty hard. So, at the end of the day, you could read the whole situation as an appeasement to German pension funds. Of course, it's a bit more complicated than that, because it's really about the credibility of the entire European Union's mechanism and the euro itself. But when the crisis hit, a lot of European principles get violated right away. First of all, if you look at a country like Ireland, just the case study that I'm kind of familiar with, the members are allowed to breach competition laws very, very quickly on state aids, etc. The Irish government, for example, was allowed and permitted to nationalise banks, large banks, and to do this, it had to pass laws in front of the national parliament that made the huge, enormous debts of these banks the people's debt, right? So the Irish people took the debts from these banks and said, we'll take those debts from you. They'll be our debts now. And as a nation, we'll have to pay them back. No, we didn't cause these problems, but this debt, we'll take it from your hands, because the alternative is that these banks go under. And if the banks go under, that could possibly crater the entire Irish economy. So again, just very simply, really, Article 104 had prohibited the European Union from lending. And the national states were on their own in terms of dealing with them. But of course, I'm talking about the peripheral countries, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Ireland. They were left on their own to deal with these banks, these sort of shitty banks that had these huge debts, and there were, they basically, the debts had to be nationalized. Now, many people are critical of how the EU has handled this, and there's a whole lot that I could say here, but I don't have the time. So I'm going to basically just sort of jump over the debates and tell you that in 2013, the European Union finally sort of woke up and shifted its policy. In 2012, the European Central Bank Governor, Mario Draghi, makes a speech where he sort of seems to fess up that the weakened condition of the peripheral countries, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Italy as well, has really left, the Europe with a serious credibility problem. The euro itself has a credibility problem. And so they're going to step in, the European Central Bank is going to step in to save the euro, so to speak, right? And they're going to introduce something called, and this is very technical, you don't necessarily need to know this if you're not interested, but I'll tell you anyway. They used a mechanism called OMTs, outright monetary transactions. Now, OMT, OMT. Under OMT, the European Central Bank is going to be able to do something called quantitative easing. It's going to be able to buy bonds issued by... Now remember, 104 had said this was prohibited, right? Not allowed to lend to the states. But under QE, or OMT, whatever you want to call it, the European Central Bank is going to be able to buy government-issued bonds maturing in a period of time, say 2, 3, 4 years, and provide then those bond-issuing countries with cash in exchange for their bonds, so long as they meet certain conditions, and those conditions include getting their public debts in order. So this is kind of like what Varoufakis calls the extend and pretend. Varoufakis calls it extend and pretend because he believes that the debts that these countries now owe because they've nationalized their banks can never ever be repaid. It's simply too much money. It'll take generations and generations to repay those debts. And how do you hold future Irish citizens, future Greek citizens accountable for the sins of banks 20 years ago? It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem right. And there's a tradition in capitalism even, but throughout the length and breadth of economic history of forgiving debt that just simply cannot be repaid, right? It's called bankruptcy. And usually we have a way of allowing people to work out their bankruptcy and the debts get written off. So why is this being extended and pretended? Why aren't the debts getting written off? This would seem to be legitimate bankruptcy. But of course, if the debts were written off, certain actors like the German pension funds, but also the euro itself, and also the anti-inflationary principles of the European Central Bank would be compromised. So no one really gets a free pass, is the point. And the conditionalities are going to be there in order to legitimize the plan. It's a way of saying that these countries need transfer of cash, they need a bailout, and they're going to get a bailout, but the pain that they'll suffer as a result will be quite measurable. So that kind of brings us up to where we are today. Where are we with this now? Where are we with the European financial crisis today? Now, this is kind of basically, I suppose, a point where we can say that what one author calls the doom loop of the financial crisis has kind of been broken finally. The introduction of QE has definitely appease the minds of speculators and politicians, and for the greater part, I think, citizens in Europe. But there's still tremendous economic hardship on the margins. I'm more familiar with the case of Ireland, obviously, because I'm from there and I tend to study what's going on there. And I can tell you that, this Christmas, for example, there was a chronic homelessness crisis because with the collapse of the property market, there's no new houses being built. And if there's no new houses being built, then, what are you going to do? There's nowhere for young people who are getting married, making a start in life, to move. They're having to stay at home, or people are being priced out of their rents because rents are shooting through the roof. And if you've lost your job in a high rent economy, you're going to be homeless. So we had hundreds of people homeless in Dublin City this winter. Thankfully, it was a mild winter, but it's not something you want to see in a developed Western economy. So the present snapshot is that the sort of crisis itself seems to be forestalled. Credit is flowing. QE has kind of, as Varoufakis says, extended and pretended the whole situation. There's still an awful lot of debt to be repaid. It's still unclear how the European Union is going to be able to move forward out of this context. In July 2016, the current British Prime Minister Theresa May said that monetary policy, and I'm just quoting here, in the form of super low interest rates and quantitative easing, has helped those on the property ladder at the expense of those who can't afford their own home. I think that applies in Ireland and in many countries as well. It's helped those on the property ladder because it's eased interest rates by the European Central Bank buying these bonds. It's sort of it flooded cash into the market, made cash more abundant, and tried to provide stimulus that way, which has the effect of lowering interest rates. But low interest rates are going to help people who have money, who are looking for mortgages to maybe afford these super expensive homes. If you're someone who doesn't have a good credit rating, someone who just doesn't have the ready money to meet the first sort of upfront payments for a mortgage, that's going to be tricky. You're going to be left abandoned in the rental market instead. And normally, rental markets are not a bad place to be, right? But right now, they certainly are, especially in countries like Ireland. So okay, I hope this has been helpful. My goal today has been to try to talk you through an alternative reading of the European financial crisis, which is not to do with mainstream liberal theory and integration theory, which is teleological in nature and brings us sort of into a naive vision of stages and stages of spillover, which are going to bring various types of integration in the economy together to produce finally a United States of Europe. And the theory that I've given you today is neither that nor a straight reading of a post-Keynesian Mark Blythe kind of account that simply blames the Germans or blames neoliberal ideology for what's happened here. Instead, what I've tried to do is look at structural realities, the end of the Bretton Woods system, and the difficulty that left the European project with in trying to create a common currency to allow manufacturers in the wealthy countries to achieve what they wanted, which was to locate manufacturing in countries where labor was cheap. But ultimately realizing that they couldn't do it the way they wanted to do it, which would have been originally to have a tax and transfer scheme to allow wealth accumulated in the center to cycle through in welfare payments to the periphery. After Bretton Woods collapses, that's just not going to be possible for the European Union. There's too much disagreement in the culture between anti-inflationary Germans in their mindset and anti-unemployment culture mindset of the French So basically, it's going to be left to a kind of a default coin toss. The most powerful country is going to get to call the shot, and the European Central Bank, when it's formed, has a very German accent, okay? And that means it's going to be an anti-inflationary mechanism primarily. So when the European project introduces its currency or capital liberalization, you're kind of setting up already for a fall. You're going to have flows of currency through lending as opposed through welfare transfers. And this is going to create the time bomb that ultimately exploded in the face of the Europeans in the aftermath of the sort of shock wave of what happened to the Wall Street finance houses in 2008. The credit crunch, revealed the crisis that had been brewing in Europe already for 10 years. And in a sense, while the Germans had, in their minds, been committed to an anti-inflationary strategy, and they thought that was great, what they didn't realize was that they were priming a bomb, a debt bomb, that was going to create a massive boom in the housing markets on the periphery, which could not be sustained. And when that bubble would burst, many people were going to be left unable to meet their mortgage obligations. And that lack of ability to pay your mortgage was going to completely capsize the peripheral banking mechanisms, the peripheral banking institutions of the European Union. And that's really where we are today. The recovery has been ongoing, but the debt is still there. It's unclear if the mortgage market in Ireland is functioning. It looks like it might be, but tremendous homelessness, and the story is still unfolding. So I'll leave it there for now, guys. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next week. Bye bye.